This story caught my eye for a particular, very specific reason, because to me it signalled at least a public shift in some of the approach that an energy producer tends to put out. And there's this story about Origin Energy shutting Australia's largest coal-fired power plant 7 years early by 2025. And I just want to highlight that this particular quote that came from the company's CEO. The reality is the economics of coal-fired power stations are being put under increasing unsustainable pressure by cleaner and low-cost generation, including solar, wind, and batteries. Now, I listened to that and I was bemused because I thought, with all the hoopla that was going on about baseload power, making sure that the industry, the coal industry, that's the backbone of everything. That's what makes everything go. To hear that as the reasoning, I mean, it makes sense, obviously, because that's the progression of a market when it's shifting. But to hear it coming from the company's CEO in such a public forum like that, I thought was significant, but also somewhat ironic, because it seemed like renewables were being like sort of not written off, but sort of tarnished with this. They're just a side project sort of vibe, and now all of a sudden they're not. From a market point of view,
claim for baseload power, originates 10 years ago, where we had a very different grid. Now so many people in Australia are producing their own electricity, and more are increasingly storing them on batteries. What I find interesting in that statement, though, to the market is that it doesn't make economic sense to have a coal-fired power station anymore, but there's no reference to whether or not that baseload is actually required. So there's two ways this can go, which is maybe that base load still is required, but it just doesn't make any economic sense to produce it, in which case the grid is going to change remarkably, as it is changing remarkably anyway. And I think there are things that should be realised, about those who argue that we need base load power. There are times, during the day when you have peak metropolitan processing in places like South Australia where we don't need any electricity. We don't need base load because it's being produced. So you can't upregulate and downregulate coal-fired plants. They take days to up and down regulate. So if you need more power at night because the sun goes down, it means you have to work at a loss all day. So that's the economics of not having a coal-fired plant. What it means for those of us on the grid, and what it means our role in producing any shortfall in the future will be, who knows? A very exciting experiment, I guess.
Indeed. I mean, I still thought it was significant for it to be worded in that way, particularly because it's the first time I've noticed, so I'll put that qualification that I've noticed. There could have been other instances of it where it was put in terms of the market and the impact and what makes sense, as opposed to being an aspiration or whatever, as in the past.
Well, I think this is what's, interesting. We're watching an energy revolution now unfold, and it's unfolding at a market level. So, I think the old arguments about the lights will go out, or we need coal or we don't need coal are kind of redundant. We're going to work out what we need very shortly. It might be a rocky road, or it might be a smooth transition. Nobody can say, but the one thing that's sure is coal's days are numbered, and we're going to see a whole new way of energy production and consumption, supply and demand in the future.
Absolutely. And also sort of a related sort of topic is more interest in investment in renewable energy projects in coal regions like the Hunter Valley, etc., where, again, it's it's like I wouldn't say you couldn't say it's picked up pace, but it feels like there's more attention and energy being driven into it, because now it's suddenly become a market-driven thing that makes sense for people making money from it. And also, I guess there's a political angle to it, because you don't want all these workers that are working in coal-fired power stations out on their ass getting angry at the fact that they lost their job and they couldn't be sort of retrained to work in a new environment. So there's a lot of factors going on there.
Well, that's right, and you certainly don't want anyone in an electorate feeling that way just before a federal election. So it's a very tricky scenario. You don't want anyone feeling that way long term about their prospects either. So there needs to be a big shift in Australia and Australian thinking. I think both probably politically but also both at just the general societal level. Things aren't going to go on the way that they always have. And that's unfortunately or fortunately where we find ourselves at, in a post-COVID, post-coal or post-fossil fuel world.